Welcome to the Black Anarchist podcast, a channel where critical thinkers come to learn and grow. Through pedagogical discussions, we challenge the status quo, conventional narratives, and present raw truth. I'm JC, author of Blame It on the Dress, The Manufacturing of Black Homophobia and Performative Masculinity. Today we're going to discuss the civilized brute. The civilized brute is an archetype that I created as a juxtaposition to Charles Dickens' essay, The Noble Savage. In his piece, Dickens launches a merciless assault on romanticized perceptions of what he derisively calls the noble savage, declaring outright that he has not the least belief in the concept. The title itself is a mockery. Dickens is making a mockery of the very notion that those who are primitive can possess nobility. He dismisses the noble savage as a prodigious nuisance and an enormous superstition, characterizing them as inherently cruel, false, thievish, and murderous. Dickens methodically deconstructs any suggestion that the noble savage possesses admirable qualities, portraying their customs as barbaric, their governance as tyrannical, and their very existence as an impediment to human progress. He contends that civilization represents an immeasurably superior and higher power, concluding that the world will be vastly improved when the noble savage ceases to exist. For Dickens, the displacement of the noble savage by civilized society is not merely inevitable, but morally justified and beneficial to humanity. While Dickens extols civilization as the superior force destined to rightfully supplant the noble savage, I propose we examine an equally troubling archetype, the civilized brute. The civilized brute embodies the sinister underbelly of the very civilization Dickens champions so fervently. This figure represents the contradictions and hypocrisies inherent in so-called civilized society, revealing that beneath the veneer of law, religion, and social order lurks a creature far more dangerous and destructive than any noble savage Dickens could conjure. The civilized brute is profoundly violent, yet unlike the noble savage, he refuses to engage in violence with honesty and transparency. Instead, he conceals his brutality behind the apparatus of the state and the authority of religion. Where the noble savage might commit isolated acts of violence on a limited scale, the civilized brute orchestrates violence on an unprecedented level through institutions, legal frameworks, and systematic oppression. The civilized brute wages perpetual war driven by an insatiable thirst for global domination. He fundamentally rejects the noble savage's right to independent existence. Instead, he invades the noble savage's territories, imposes his will upon them, and presents this conquest as beneficial to those he subjugates. In reality, every gesture of supposed benevolence serves exclusively his own interests. This archetype systematically exploits the noble savage's labor while pillaging their resources. He constructs elaborate justifications for this theft, developing legal and moral frameworks that legitimize his plunder. The civilized brute then weaponizes Christianity, perverting religious doctrine to justify his violence and immoral behavior, corrupting spiritual teachings to serve his material ambitions. Perhaps most disturbing in the civilized brute's complete absence of empathy for other human beings, including those within his own society. He regards other people as invisible, perceiving them merely as instruments for his own advancement. His sole concerns are power and the accumulation of access, and he remains utterly indifferent to the methods by which he obtains them. The civilized brute will rob, cheat, and steal to achieve success, yet presents himself as having earned his position through merit alone. His happiness is extracted from everyone else's suffering. He accumulates wealth by dispossessing others, then fabricates elaborate narratives about his virtue and industrialness to justify his ill-gotten gains. Though he recognizes that he spreads misery wherever he ventures, the civilized brute denies people even the acknowledgement of their own suffering. Instead, he creates a society where everyone is compelled to pretend to be happy while enduring genuine misery. This performative happiness serves to obscure the systematic oppression that sustains his power. The civilized brute proclaims himself a champion of freedom while demonstrating complete indifference to authentic liberty. His sole occupation is enslavement and oppression, though he disguises these through legal and institutional mechanisms. He cares exclusively about his own freedom while systematically denying freedom to others. This archetype is profoundly superficial and materialistic, worldly, and godless. Though he claims to believe in God, he usurps God and claims this role for himself. The civilized brute is extraordinarily arrogant. He refuses to acknowledge any wrongdoing, never apologizes for anything, and accepts no accountability for his actions. The civilized brute insists on maintaining a monopoly over the use of physical force. He denies others the right to employ physical force, even in self-defense against his aggression. Nothing is sacred to him. He recognizes no boundaries and will descend as far as circumstances permit, displaying no self-restraint in his pursuit of power. His distrust of others stems from his fundamental distrust of himself. Possessing no concept of right and wrong beyond legal permissibility, he assumes others think exactly as he does. He exists in perpetual paranoia, projecting his moral bankruptcy onto others. He believes that if others obtain power, they would inflict upon him what he has inflicted upon them. The civilized brute accuses the noble savage of barbarism, yet he is the one who is truly cruel and barbaric. While the noble savage may have engaged in acts of violence, these were isolated incidents on a much smaller scale. Conversely, the civilized brute engages in systematic acts of violence on a massive, institutionalized scale. The civilized brute possesses no concept of right and wrong independent of law. If something is legal, it becomes acceptable to him. The law serves as his sole moral compass. Without it, he would have no ethical framework whatsoever. Yet he weaponizes both religion and law to oppress others while exempting himself from these very principles. This represents perhaps his most insidious characteristic. The civilized brute manipulates Christianity and legal systems as instruments of control while liberating himself from their moral constraints. He invokes religious doctrine to justify enslaving others, claiming it represents God's will or divine providence, yet violates every principle of compassion, humility, and love that these same religions teach. He employs scripture to rationalize conquest, exploitation, and genocide while living in direct contradiction to every spiritual value he purports to uphold. While various societies throughout history have practiced slavery, the civilized brute's approach represents a uniquely paradoxical and systematically brutal form of human bondage. Unlike other forms of slavery that were often acknowledged as what they were, the subjugation of conquered people or debtors, the civilized brute transforms slavery into a moral good, a civilizing mission, even a divine blessing upon the enslaved. This represents perhaps the most insidious form of psychological torture, forcing the enslaved to participate in the fiction of their own liberation while experiencing brutal subjugation. Where other slaveholders might openly acknowledge their exploitation of human beings as necessary for their economic interests or as a natural order of conquest, the civilized brute uniquely demands that his slaves thank him for their bondage. He constructs elaborate theological and philosophical justifications that transform slavery from a crime into a virtue, from oppression into liberation. The enslaved must not only submit their bodies, but also their capacity to recognize their own subjugation. They are compelled to express gratitude for their chains, to celebrate their dehumanization, and to participate in elaborate rituals that present their exploitation as their salvation. This creates a form of slavery more psychologically devastating than any previously conceived, one that demands the victims celebrate their victimization. The civilized brute's slavery attacks not merely the body but the very soul, requiring the enslaved to collaborate in their own mental annihilation. He forces entire generations to internalize the belief that their enslavement represents progress, that their suffering constitutes blessing, and that their resistance to bondage demonstrates their own moral inferiority. What makes the civilized brute slavery fundamentally more devastating than other historical forms is his construction of elaborate institutional frameworks that legitimize and protect his right to own human beings. While other societies may have practiced slavery through conquest or economic necessity, they rarely constructed comprehensive legal, religious, and social institutions specifically designed to sanctify human bondage as a permanent and divinely ordained system. The civilized brute creates courts that uphold his property rights in human flesh, churches that preach theological necessity of slavery, universities that develop scientific justifications for human bondage, and governments that deploy military force to capture and return escaped slaves to their owners. These institutions do not merely facilitate slavery, they transform it into a sacred right, making the civilized brute's ownership of other human beings a cornerstone of social order itself. The enslaved cannot appeal to any institutional authority for justice because every institution has been designed to confirm their status as property. They cannot seek refuge in religion because the churches teach that their bondage serves God's will. They cannot pursue education because the schools indoctrinate them with theories of their own inferiority. They cannot expect protection from the state because the government exists to enforce their enslavement. Most perversely, the civilized brute's institutional framework criminalizes the enslaved's most fundamental human instinct, the desire for freedom. Any attempt at resistance becomes not just disobedience, but a violation of the civilized brute's sacred property rights. The slave who seeks to escape is branded a thief, stealing himself from his rightful owner. The slave who rebels is not a freedom fighter, but a criminal destroying valuable property. The slave who refuses to work is not asserting human dignity, but committing the crime of damaging his master's economic interests. Through this institutional alchemy, the civilized brute transformed the enslaved person's natural human responses into moral transgressions, making the victim's resistance to victimization evidence of their criminality and moral deficiency. This represents a unique form of moral depravity that transcends the brutality of other historical slaveholding societies. While other oppressors might acknowledge their exploitation as necessary evil or conquest's natural consequence, the civilized brute alone constructs comprehensive systems that make human bondage not merely permissible but sacred, not merely profitable but righteous, not merely legal but divinely mandated. The civilized brute's approach to slavery reveals the full extent of his moral perversion. He alone, among oppressors, requires his victim to love their oppression, to find meaning in their meaninglessness, and to discover freedom in their bondage. This represents not merely physical domination, but the complete colonization of consciousness itself. The enslaved becomes accomplices in their own destruction, unable to envision liberation because they have been taught to experience enslavement as the highest form of human existence, and because every institution they might turn to for salvation has been perverted to ensure their continued bondage. Similarly, he creates laws that constrain others while ensuring his own immunity. He establishes legal frameworks that criminalize the survival strategies of the oppressed while legitimizing his own theft and violence. The civilized brute authors laws that make it illegal for others to defend themselves against his aggression, while his systematic violence receives sanction from the very legal system he controls. He demands that others obey moral codes and legal statutes that he routinely violates with absolute impunity. The civilized brute preaches law and order while serving as the primary source of disorder. He speaks of Christian values while embodying everything Christ opposed. This hypocrisy is not accidental but strategic. By positioning himself as the interpreter and enforcer of both divine and human law, he gains authority to determine who deserves punishment and who merits mercy, always ensuring that he and his class remain protected while others bear the full weight of the system he has corrupted. The civilized brute performs charity, but his philanthropy constitutes merely another form of exploitation. He appropriates other people's resources, returns a small portion of what he has stolen, then presents himself as noble for his supposed generosity. This performance of charity legitimizes his theft while enhancing his reputation. The civilized brute cannot think independently. His thoughts are not his own. He has been thoroughly indoctrinated by the systems that serve his interests. He functions as an automaton programmed to perpetuate structures of oppression while believing himself free and enlightened. Though highly intelligent, the civilized brute possesses the wrong type of intellect. Rather than employing his intellect to help others solve genuine problems, he weaponizes his intelligence for domination and exploitation. He never experiences true remorse because his sophisticated intellect allows him to rationalize any action irrespective of its objective harm. The civilized brute is profoundly dishonest and serves as a primary architect of propaganda for his oppressive systems. He would never tolerate being subjected to the treatment he inflicts on others, but because he considers himself superior, he assumes such treatment would never be directed towards him. The civilized brute is indifferent to right and wrong. His sole concern is winning. If everyone behaved as he does and treated others as he treats them, it would literally be hell on earth. He clings to his laws even when their consequences are manifestly unjust, demonstrating no capacity for moral reasoning beyond legal technicalities. Despite his pretense of leadership, the civilized brute is fundamentally a follower. He possesses no rebellious instincts and knows only how to execute orders within hierarchical systems. All he understands is compliance. Although he pretends to exercise control, he is merely another follower. His so-called civilization is hierarchical, and everyone serves as a slave to those above them. Everyone is enslaved to each other. His civilization represents the antithesis to freedom. People may envy the civilized brute because they perceive him as having power and success, but they fail to recognize that he is actually enslaved to his hunger and quest for power. He cannot exist peacefully with others because domination is his only mode of interaction. He believes that failure to dominate others inevitably results in being dominated by them. The civilized brute inhabits a world of perpetual conflict because he cannot conceive of relationships based on mutualism and cooperation. His worldview is fundamentally zero-sum. For him to win, others must lose. This makes him incapable of creating the very civilization he claims to represent. Most insidiously, the civilized brute creates a system where the noble savage is compelled to become civilized, not out of genuine desire for progress, but out of sheer necessity for survival. Unless the noble savage adopts the ways of civilization, the civilized brute will not acknowledge his right to exist. The choice presented is stark and merciless: become civilized or face elimination, dispossession, and the theft of land and natural resources. This is not civilization offering enlightenment. This is civilization wielding extermination as a weapon of conversion. Civilization as constructed by the civilized brute becomes a race to the bottom rather than an ascent toward human progress. This race compels all participants to abandon their moral principles in favor of competitive brutality. Those who refuse to engage in exploitation, deception, and violence find themselves at a systematic disadvantage. The civilized brute rewards the most ruthless behavior while punishing compassion, honesty, and genuine virtue. In this perverted system, success requires the abandonment of everything that might genuinely elevate humanity. Kindness becomes weakness, honesty becomes foolishness, and cooperations become naivete. The civilized brute has created a structure where moral degradation is not merely rewarded, it is essential for survival. Those who maintain their integrity face marginalization, poverty, and eventual destruction by those willing to descend to any depth for advancement. This race to the bottom ensures that civilization continuously devolves rather than evolves. Each generation must become more callous, more deceptive, and more brutal than the last to compete effectively. The civilized brute has constructed a system that systematically eliminates the best aspects of human nature while amplifying the worst. What emerges is not civilization, but organized barbarism masquerading as progress. a sophisticated mechanism for ensuring that only the most morally bankrupt individuals achieve positions of power and influence. In contrast to the noble savage who may engage in violence but does so with an understood cultural context and limitations, the civilized brute represents violence systematized, institutionalized, and disguised as virtue. Where Dickens perceived the apex of human progress in his civilized society, we might instead recognize the civilized brute as civilization's greatest threat, not its triumph, but its corruption. The civilized brute reveals that true barbarism lies not in the absence of civilization's institutions, but in their perversion and abuse. While Dickens argues that the world will improve when the noble savage disappears, one might contend that the world would be immeasurably enhanced if the civilized brute's influence were diminished, allowing for forms of social organization based on genuine justice, empathy, and mutual respect rather than systematic exploitation masquerading as progress. Thank you for listening to the Black Anarchist podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The struggle is real, and the fight for liberation is far from over. Get sovereign or die trying.